Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole, coming to you live from our offices at Miller and Chevalier in downtown DC. What's up, Tim?
Live from Black Lives Matter Plaza in
Exactly.
downtown DC. Good to see you, Brian.
Good to see you. Welcome back to everybody. Apologies that we've had a brief pause in our normal schedule, which was occasioned by some international travel and the continued frantic and chaotic pace of trying to keep up with all things Russia these days and advising folks about those issues pretty much around the clock still, as we're stretching into the end of month number 2 of this insanity. So, but thank you for joining us. Happy to have everybody back. Before we get started, just the normal disclaimers: we're not giving legal advice, we're not sharing confidential information, and in all opinions that you hear today are mine or Tim's. If you disagree, blame us. If you enjoy the pod, spread the word. Please subscribe. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. You can get us anywhere you get your pod content. So before I go through the roadmap, any kind of quick thoughts before we get started here today, Mr. O'Toole?
Fast and furious. These questions are still coming in.
Yeah.
Fast and furious.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute because I think, not surprisingly, we're going to start with Russia, topic number 1, which is, we threatened the last time to do just all sorts of obscure sanctions and export controls topics that only Tim and I care about. But sadly, we, I think, are going to give the people what they want. And we're going to start with Russia again. We are then going to, so that's going to be topic number 1. We're going to cover the latest and greatest that has occurred in the last several weeks since we recorded the last episode. We're then going to move on to North Korea and a sentencing in a pretty significant case that we've talked about previously up in SDNY. And then finally, in the lightning round, we're going to hit one topic, which I'm going to use. We will use the U.S.-Iran matchup in the upcoming World Cup as the jumping off point for that. But there's, I think, some very interesting issues that are percolating in the world of sports globally as a result of what's happening in Ukraine right now and other sort of related geopolitical events. And so we'll touch on those things briefly at the end of the show. So with that, we will go ahead and get started and jump right into Russia. So as I alluded to already, we're almost at the 2-month mark now since the invasion of Ukraine began and the U.S. and global response on the sanctions and export controls front began immediately. And so why don't I, before I get into a couple of the sort of just specific topics that we want to cover, and again, we're not going to try to even address every single thing that has occurred in the last, 3.5, 4 weeks since we last recording this on April 21st. It has been almost a month since we recorded the last episode. The pace has not really slowed significantly in terms of new actions that are coming out both from the US and the EU and the UK and all around the world. So before we get into any of the specifics, there are a couple of items we are going to hit and discuss, but let me open it up the way I did the last time, Tim. Any other just kind of thoughts, observations, musings that you have given what's now transpired the last month since we last talked on air, given what we've seen now for the first 2 months? Any surprises, any interesting developments? Just kind of generally give you the floor for anything to start off with here.
Yeah, 2 big thoughts. I mean, the first is that the ratcheting up of sanctions, and particularly the listing of Sberbank, which we'll talk about, has made it practically, although not legally, impossible for U.S. companies to stay in Russia without a greatly increased U.S. sanctions risk. It's really hard for companies to operate there, even if theoretically they could. And then and I think you'll talk about why in just a second. And then I think the second thing, and what I'm really waiting is for the biggest shoe to drop, and that is what is the coalition going to do about energy transactions? I mean, it's clear that there is a real tension between the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada, I think, on one side, and the European Union, mostly Germany and France, on the other. With the U.S. UK side not being that reliant on Russian oil, and with the German and gas, and with the German side being very reliant on Russian oil and gas, and so far they've kind of managed to straddle that by each country has its own import ban if they want to, but the EU has not done anything like that. But with the general license in the U.S. expiring in June, I think that we're getting to the point where that's really the biggest issue that's remaining, and will create all sorts of havoc when it gets resolved.
Yeah, and to that point, obviously, as we're coming out of the winter months, and obviously a number of observers have picked up on this, that less uh, energy dependency in the cold weather months in Europe and other places that are quite tied to Russian energy. Is that going to perhaps open the door a little bit to a more aggressive approach on this? I wouldn't be shocked if it does, especially given the way things are trending with the war, which shows no signs of letting up. There's been Putin has started engaging in some pretty serious saber rattling now with the ballistic missile testing and some other provocative acts. So no signs that this is going to resolve anytime soon. And as we've observed, and many others have observed, even if it does resolve at some point in the near future, we're not resetting to a February 1 pre-invasion world anytime soon. This is going to be the reality for a long time to come in all likelihood. And so, what that looks like, but to the point Tim made, whether the energy sector perhaps becomes the big pressure point that the U.S. and allies try to push on here with respect to Russia, to perhaps increase the pain to a degree that maybe decision making would be impacted on the Russian side. We'll see. There's also, I think, coming, and I think we may have alluded to this the last time, but there is going to be a reckoning coming relatively soon with regard to Russia being able to service all of its debt, and the fact that the U.S. has been cutting off, has conspicuously and publicly been cutting off the ability of either the Russian central bank or other levers of the Russian financial sector to be able to avail themselves of any funds or resources that are in the U.S. to do that. And so as time drags on, there's going to be, and this has been written about extensively, obviously, the threat of a default, grows increasingly large, if not unavoidable at some point, and what that may mean, I think is a very interesting question that we're going to have to see. And obviously, in many ways, this is kind of the logical and intended conclusion of what was set in motion in late February, early March with respect to the expansive sanctions on the financial sector. So that's probably a good segue to jump into sort of the first topic that we want to look at, which is rewinding back a couple weeks to April 6th, which is a couple of things happened on April 6th that are really notable. One, Tim already alluded to, which is Sparebank went from, this very interesting approach that we had seen initially with respect to, the very specially crafted directive that was designed to just cut Sparebank off from, correspondent banking in the U.S. and was meant to, curtail / prohibit the U.S. financial sector from being able to be involved in any sort of transactions relating to Sparebank. Well, that all went out the window when they got blocked on April 6th. And so, as Tim said, that was a pretty clear ratcheting up that the U.S. Undertook at that point. Alpha Bank, also the largest privately held bank in Russia, blocked on the same day. So those two steps right there, a very big deal. And I know from certainly my experience in the first month or so of the post-invasion sanctions landscape, had many discussions with folks who were like, well, but Sparebank is still in play because they're not blocked, and we can do this and we can do that. And all of that was true at the time, but not anymore. Or
Well,
not after the end of the very short general license that applied after, which I think was only,
1 week.
it was
It
a
was a
week. Yeah, that
week.
was it. And so
Yeah.
that's already gone. And so now people are scrambling to understand and to figure out what they can do with Sparebank and can't do with Sparebank. So
No, I had a client who was trying to explain to the board that he answers to kind of what this was like, and his analogy was, well, it's just imagine that if you had to do business in the United States and Bank of America and JP Morgan were blocked in a particular day, like it'd be pretty
right,
hard,
right.
and that resonated.
Yeah, that's a good analogy to sort of hammer home the scope and the impact of this. And so that was April 6th. A whole host of things happened on April 6th. There were a number of other folks that were put on the SDN list, including some sort of Putin enablers, facilitators, family members, etc. But the other big thing, quite frankly, that happened on April 6th that we want to talk about a little bit is the new executive order that was issued on that day, 14071, which, for those who are not familiar, is the executive order that imposes, by OFAC's very own words, an expansive new investment ban in Russia, which applies to all U.S. persons and all new investment in Russia. And we'll come back to that in a minute, because that, not surprisingly, has caused a lot of heartburn and consternation in the 2 weeks since that executive order was issued, because OFAC did not issue any real guidance to help anybody
Still
understand what that
hasn't.
really means, and still hasn't. So we cut our friends at OFAC a little slack on that front. We've been part of some informal discussions wherein we understand that they are working on that. We get all of that, but that doesn't sort of solve the problem in the short term for the regulated community, which is effectively the entire world at this point. And then the other interesting piece of that same executive order is there is also a prohibition on the export, re-export, sale, supply from the U.S. or by U.S. persons, wherever located, of any category of services as may be determined by Secretary of Treasury in consult with the Secretary of State. Now, that has not yet been defined or identified. No category of services has yet been identified. But this one also, obviously, for obvious reasons, has people very nervous that we're about to be in for, some very broad, sweeping prohibitions that are going to be put in place in terms of rendering of services with respect to Russia. Now, obviously, we already have a big expansion on the export control side with respect to physical goods, software, technology that can be exported to Russia at this point from the U.S. or that are U.S. origin. This is, in some ways, kind of the logical extension or flip of that. And so, what that will ultimately be, I think, is a big question mark right now. But let me stop there and just pause to sort of turn it to you, Tim. What do we, especially on the new investment ban, which I think is certainly the one that I am hearing about the most. I think you are hearing about the most at this point. We've talked to a large extent about the practical difficulties of any kind of payment processing or financial transacting in Russia at this point, given Sparebank, Alpha Bank, and all the other major banks that have now been blocked. But on the new investment side, what is, sort of pick up on a couple threads of what you've been hearing? What are sort of the most interesting questions and unresolved issues that you're sort of dealing with at this point?
Yes, so that part of the problem is that there's not guidance, and so the new investment prohibition is piggybacked on an earlier prohibition. Was that there was a prohibition on new investment in the energy sector, and so there was a little guidance on that, but the guidance there is I think has some problematic language in it, because it talks about investment being any commitment of funds, and then just gives this incredibly expansive definition. And so, there were some questions coming in at the beginning about whether even, the payment of salaries could be new investment, because they're not necessarily pursuant to a new agreement. And certainly, they could, but certainly a new employee would be pursuant to a new agreement. And so, is that a new investment of funds? You hire somebody to work they're replacing another worker, but they're still, you know, a new agreement to commit funds to a particular worker. Even that could fall within the pretty expansive definition if the one that was created for the energy sector applied. And so there still is a lot of question about that. There's also, question about whether or not wind down activities could constitute new investment, because some of the clients that I've talked to have been talking about getting out, but getting out responsibly, so that they would try and kind of give the operation that they had built in Russia a chance to survive as they leave. And so either selling the operation to the management, but if that happens, the current operation has a computer connection to the US. Would they replace the computer system by committing funds to a new computer system? Is that new investment in Russia on the way out? Right now, there's no formal guidance. We've heard informally through the grapevine that divestment is not going to be considered to be new investment. But what does that mean? I mean, that's a nice mantra, and it's better than what exists. But right now, the only thing that they've written down is that maintenance is not new investment and repair is not new investment. But there's a whole lot of other categories of expenses that could fall within the new investment definition if it's as broad as the earlier one for the energy sector. On the other hand, I can't possibly believe that was what OFAC meant when it had the new investment ban. So it's going to be just a mess right now.
Right, and I think on the couple of points that you just made, this idea of kind of maintenance of pre-existing ongoing operations, whether it's keep keep those going or to wind them down, I think that, it seems pretty clear that is not the intent. And then, in fact, we've also heard that, for those who are sort of trying to distinguish this in your minds, the new investment ban does not equal an embargo, right? That is
Right.
not, just to sort of, have some logical distinction in your mind. A new investment ban is, and there have been times when this similar language has been used in other programs, and then eventually it's kind of subsumed by an embargo. So it's never clarified all that well or extensively, because once an embargo is in place, it's pretty clear rules. It's much easier. But this idea of new investment, while there is no embargo, I think is really driving people a little, insane at the moment. And, as a practical matter, looking on a case by case or a transaction by transaction or a, venture by venture, business unit by business unit basis, whatever it may be. I mean, that's essentially what has to happen at the moment, is that
But
these things are being looked at on case by case, and then there's some documented, usually, analysis of whether that is on the right side of the line or not, and then you proceed or you don't proceed based on that. But
it's
that's
so
what a lot of
hard,
companies are
though.
doing.
I mean, it just is so hard because with respect to investment, I kind of feel like I know it when I see it, but the definitions can include a lot more than what anybody would really call investment. And the example that I'm sure you've seen, I've seen it too, is there's a lot of guidance under the earlier Russia sanctions program with respect to what is new debt. And OFAC has earlier taken this position that if you provide goods to someone and they have to pay you within the tenor of the debt, um, or else that is new debt that is prohibited by some of the old sanctions programs. One of the definitions of new investment includes new debt. So is a contract where essentially you provide widgets to somebody in Russia and they don't pay you for a certain amount of time, does that create a new debt that is a form of new investment? The answer has to be no. But theoretically, with the old definitions, you can easily get to yes, and that's what's creating all the confusion.
And I have some clients I know that are either have contemplated or actually instituting advance payment requirements for any contracts in Russia for exactly that reason, so that they're trying to zero out the risk that they are going to be creating or incurring or providing new debt to Russia in any way, shape, or form. And so that's what they're trying to do. And obviously, renegotiating those commercial terms on the fly is difficult, if not impossible, sometimes. And then, because of the lack of guidance, it's just there's wild uncertainty kind of all in flowing in all directions. I will say, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, although I think we're probably pretty closely aligned on this. I have certainly walked through with a variety of different clients the true enforcement risk that might come from getting this wrong at the moment, especially if it's a close call. And I think candidly, and again, I'll re-caveat myself here by saying I'm not giving anyone out there legal advice. If you want legal advice on this, please call us offline. But um, while there is this much gray area, to Tim's point, certain types of new investment is clearly new investment. Other types that might be arguably operations and maintenance related to divestment, something that's just quite frankly in a just not clear that it is truly new or truly investment, and the two things combined. I have a really hard time believing that OFAC at some point down the road is going to go after a company who perhaps got this wrong in retrospect in the first few weeks after the new executive order came out. So again, that's not to say that anybody should not be trying to do their best to try to figure this out in the vacuum that we're in right now with no real guidance. But that is something to bear in mind, is that you have to do what you can do to be reasonable here, and there are just too many moving parts and uncertainties at the moment to be able to say, other than again, to just refuse to do anything, to treat it like an embargo and to say we just refuse to do anything. Sure, then you could do that, and that more or less zeroes out your risk in this area. But if you're not going to do that, then you have to be willing to bear a little bit of risk given the uncertainty, and you have to just again document it and doc all the reasonable steps you're taking to try to get it right.
Yeah, I mean that's basically what I've been telling clients too. Again, not legal advice here, but if the goal, the purpose of a lot of these a lot of these new prohibitions, a lot of these new sanctions, to me appears to be to essentially cause U.S. companies to get out of Russia. That appears to be the foreign policy goal of the current administration. And so what I've been telling a lot of clients is if that's what you're doing, if you're getting out of Russia and you make responsible expenses along the way that are designed to help you get out of Russia without creating chaos for the employees that have been your employees for however long or what have you, that the chances that there will be an enforcement action for that are very, 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 very low. They're not zero because of all the ambiguity, but they're so low because you are essentially fulfilling U.S. foreign policy by getting out, and the idea that they would somehow use these ambiguous new investment prohibitions to call some expense that you made in the course of really getting out of Russia a violation of the sanctions just strikes me as almost zero, if it's not zero.
And back to the point Tim made earlier, which I think is a good one, you know, new investment when you see it. Quite clearly, I think the idea that if somebody had in the hopper as of January 2022 entering into some new joint venture in Russia, or establishing a brand new wholly owned subsidiary in Russia, or something along those lines, right? Those things I think probably now off the table, right? I mean, those are pretty clearly, I think, on the side of these are new investments, and obviously many of the because the new investment ban started in the energy sector, as Tim mentioned, a few weeks prior to this broader executive order coming out. We saw and have seen already a number of major players, U.S. and European, who have very high profile projects in the energy sector pull out and announce they were pulling out and they were leaving. And whether that was anything they were going to be doing or contemplated to be doing going forward was new or not, it was clear they had made the calculus that it was going to be too risky, both from a regulatory and a sort of business brand reputational standpoint, to stay. And so they're gone. And as Tim said, I think that's ultimately the policy goal here, both by the U.S. and its close allies, to encourage its companies to get out. And perhaps the ones that are able to stay or want to stay are the ones that have a much smaller footprint or a little trickle of business that they're just maintaining. That would be, if you do the cost benefit, it's maybe too risky or too difficult or too destructive to pull out and leave. And so to maintain that, perhaps that makes sense. But if anything that's going to require kind of routine assessment, new big landmark decisions in terms of big projects, joint ventures, et cetera, I think those things are now they're at least on pause, if not just completely scuttled at this point for the most part, if it has any
Yeah.
U.S. involvement. Yeah.
And the reason that I think this policy is designed to drive companies out is in part because, you can't get in. We know that new investment getting into Russia clearly is new investment. That's what the thrust of that prohibition is really geared toward. There's just lots of gray areas with respect to other types of expenses in Russia. But then for the companies who are trying to stay in, at least from what I'm hearing, there is a huge amount of pressure coming from the Russian government, from Russian businesses, to essentially force those companies to not only stay in Russia, which makes things hard as well, but then to engage with sanctioned entities in Russia. And that's why, personally, I think it's just very hard as a practical matter to stay, because you can't have a business that is under constant pressure to violate sanctions and stay in that jurisdiction. And that's what I'm seeing right now in Russia.
Right. Or the sort of another wrinkle that I've seen there is, forced sales to parties in
Yes,
Russia, including to sanctioned parties, right? It's like,
right.
well, if you're leaving, then you will be selling all of your assets to this entity at this price, on these terms,
Right.
and it's kind of gun to head asset sale, fire sale kind of stuff, and Russian government just kind of taking hold of it all, kind of piece by piece. So yeah, I think that's going to continue to be, uh, you know, sort of a big mess, and perhaps as more guidance does trickle out, which we do expect will happen in the coming weeks, and as time goes on, and lines get drawn, and things kind of shake out a little bit more, this will become a little easier to navigate. But right now, 2 weeks into this broad new investment ban, it's certainly a huge problem, and a constant, source of concern, we know, among, in all corners of the global economy, essentially. Let me, before we move on to, the more recent actions from this week, any thoughts on the services ban or prohibition that is now out there, but yet to be, sharpened or scoped, or, any sectors identified? What are your thoughts
Well,
on that and
well,
how
we
that's
know
going to
how
work?
these. So we know how these things work in other areas, right? So the president issues an order saying, services are prohibited in the sectors identified by the Secretary of Treasury, and you don't know what they're going to be. But then, like, the day before or the day of, they come out and issue a bunch of designations for a particular sector in the sanctioned country. There's a determination by the Secretary of Treasury that they find that this particular sector is a problem from a foreign policy standpoint and needs sanctions. I think this is just a hunch that this is kind of laying the groundwork, laying kind of the procedural framework for going after the energy sector. I think that that's the sector where there are the most services that are being provided from the West that are kind of helpful to the Russian economy right now, producing revenue for the Russian economy. And so I suspect that that's where that comes from, because everything else, the goods in that sector are now prohibited for the most part, or at least they need a license if they're not EAR 99. But the services, I think the most services coming in from the West are the energy sector, and my prediction is that at some point, probably in mid-June, the Secretary of Treasury will determine that the energy sector is one in which U.S. services need to be banned, and there will be a
Yeah.
prohibition on those
Yeah, I
services.
have a feeling, I think that's probably right. I do have a feeling that, unlike where we've seen in the past, where, with, 14024, where there have been new sectors that are getting added kind of periodically, and now we have technology, and we have electronics, and we have maritime, and we have all these other things that have been added, and then, like you said, there's an announcement that there's a determination that's been made by Secretary of Treasury in consultation with Secretary of State, and then that day or the next day there's an initial wave of sanctions that are imposed on a number of entities. I think this is going to be thrown out there. The gauntlet will be thrown down, um, with largely prospectively. I'm not quite sure how it would even work, that they would
Right.
announce it and then they would also sanction people for violating it with no notice. That would be an interesting test case, honestly. But but I think I think that's right that the energy sector seems to be the most obvious target here. Although, I could see mining and other kind of areas like that that are big revenue generators
Well,
where we know that there's a lot of Western activity or has been historically. So, so we'll see. But I think that's one. And I've had some interesting conversations with companies who are trying to game out what their risk is here. What is this going to mean? And now, obviously, if there's already decisions being made to wind down and get out, then perhaps this becomes less of an issue. But to your point, this is geared towards services that could be provided from outside of Russia, right? So you could be sitting in the U.S. or in Latin America or in Europe or Africa or anywhere else as a U.S. person, and then all of a sudden, boom, this gets issued, and you can't render those services anymore, or it's a violation. So,
Well, one thought that I'm having from this conversation is that it could be financial services, in which case that would essentially be a prohibition on dollar transactions in Russia, which currently doesn't exist. I mean, there's lots of unsanctioned Russian banks, so you can use dollars in Russia right now, although clearing them through the central bank could be tough. But there is a general license that allows at least some of that. But if the financial services were prohibited by U.S. persons, then the dollar would basically be off limits in Russia.
right, which again would make a lot of sense, would be consistent with what the current approach has been, and would just be sort of another vector to get at this particular issue for OFAC. So, in any event, I think more questions than answers there in terms of how that's going to be deployed, what it's going to look like, when it might happen. We just don't know at this point, but certainly one to keep an eye on going forward. Um, just to just to talk quickly then about something that came down yesterday, which I thought was kind of interesting. So there was so we're recording this April 21. Yesterday on the 20th, there was a big list of designations attached to some sanctions evasion network in connection with one particular SDN and a number of individuals and entities that have been deployed to allegedly evade sanctions in connection with that individual. And then, interestingly, um, there was the first set of designations that were targeting crypto miners in Russia. And for those who are unaware, Russia is kind of uniquely situated as a cryptocurrency mining hub, given what's necessary to operate big server farms and the energy resources that are necessary and the like. And this has obviously been, or was designed to be potentially a big moneymaker, revenue generator. And there was one particular um, miner that was called out, that was singled out just yesterday, um, and Bit River, and a number of Bit River affiliates and subs were also added to the SDN list yesterday. And so, just kind of another interesting wrinkle and extension that I think is worth calling attention to. And one other thing that I'll mention that actually came out yesterday. This is also a bit of an, um, this is just kind of a standalone um, FAQ that caught my attention, which was relating to credit card operators and um, payments of credit card operators relating to processing transactions involving sanctioned banks. And so, not surprisingly, and I think this is the way I would have analyzed it if I had been asked this question by by a credit card operator, is if you're a U.S. person or U.S. entity having any involvement in processing those payments that are affiliated with, run by, supported by those blocked financial institutions is going to be a problem unless there's a general license or a specific authorization in place. Interestingly, though, with respect to, and this is kind of what I want to highlight, there's a question, or there's some language in there in the FAQ response that talks about if you're a non-US operator of a credit card system and you have cards that are issued by foreign financial institutions that are subject to sanctions, there's the one line they draw is relating to using those cards in the U.S., which is interesting. That wouldn't have necessarily been what I would have thought would be highlighted there in terms of the risk there, but that was kind of the one thing that was being highlighted. I think the moral of the story, not surprisingly, is For any corner of the financial world that has any dealings with any of these sanctioned financial institutions in Russia, I think, having a clear understanding of both what your own connections are there, and then on the flip side of that, what your connections are to the United States and the possibility that anybody is going to be using these services or interfacing with these services in a way that will directly interface with the U.S. Or implicate the U.S. is, sort of the first order of business in terms of trying to understand what your risk may be. So just wanted to highlight those two things, the crypto mining thing and the credit card thing. I thought two kind of interesting, sort of subgenres, if you will, of the sort of crushing financial sanctions that we've seen kind of been rolling out over the last number of weeks.
Yeah, that the guidance that you mentioned is kind of weird. It's almost like they're worried that a bunch of tourists are coming to Washington with
With their spare bank credit
EU
cards, yeah.
credit cards, and like they're warning them that if they get here and they try to use the spare bank EU credit cards, like they're gonna that those are gonna get rejected. And it seems like there's lots of things that are on OFAC's mind that would have those small credit card transactions in the US would have been kind of lower on the list, but
I'm sure that
good
that
to
is a
know.
result of some inquiries that have come in, whether through feedback or directly in terms of advisory opinions and guidance requests. But I'm certain of that. But in all events, yeah, it is kind of a very. It seems like it's a pretty narrow issue to devote an entire FAQ to, given how many other issues are out there that have not been tackled to date. So
So now OFAC's FAQs are required reading before your family vacation to Washington, I
yeah,
think is
exactly. And
the
that's
moral of that
that's
story.
FAQ 1030, by the way, in case anybody is keeping track of that at home. Again, no shots to our friends at OFAC. We know that you're dealing with an overwhelming amount of work at the moment, but it is just sort of an interesting wrinkle. Um, just very quickly before we wrap up Russia for today and for this week, one other just sort of, just kind of one thing that caught my attention that I've had to spend some time dealing with and thinking about is, I think the last time around we highlighted the fact that, and this is to shift over now to the Commerce Department for a moment and to the export control realm, we highlighted the announcement and the press release that Commerce had issued relating to commercial and private aircraft exported to Russia, in apparent violation of the EAR, because these were U.S. Controlled aircraft, and the flag there that anybody doing anything with respect to these aircraft, whether it be servicing, maintenance, etc., risked violating General Prohibition 10, and there was a big lengthy list of all the aircraft carriers and the identification of those aircraft on that press release. Well, a few weeks later, there were temporary denial orders that were issued with respect to Aeroflot, Azure Air, and UT Air, which are three pretty significant operators in Russia. And those TDOs, for anybody who's curious or who has taken a look at them, are very, very broad. And it is the temporary denial order, which is something that I recall being deployed a number of times when I was still in government working with the folks at Commerce on these issues, but not one that we have seen that much in certainly not in this kind of high profile way of late. Um, you know, a very expansive authority that allows for the Commerce Department to essentially, kind of ring fence and make off limits the ability for folks to deal with these carriers, not just with respect to providing U.S. Controlled items to them, but in a number of other ways as well. And so, would encourage anybody to who's curious or who has any dealings in this space to sort of take a closer look at that, because that is another one. I think that just came out about 2 weeks ago, as well. I'm forgetting the precise date of that one. I think it was April 7th, so it was right around the time that the new executive order came out on the new investment ban. But I encourage folks to look at that as well. That is another interesting one, and it's certainly one that I know is having some pretty significant ripples in that sort of corner of the economy.
It's huge. I mean, I was looking at it for a client question recently, and it it is essentially an SDN prohibition coming from commerce. I mean, it's not exactly, but for pretty much no dealings with
Right.
respect to any items
Yep.
that are subject to the EAR. And I mean, that is very unusual. And we're talking about Aeroflot, we're talking about, big airlines in Russia, and it kind of, because of all the other sanctions, really, no pun intended, but flew under the radar. And it's now, when I went to kind of look at the question that I got on this, I was thinking, that it would be relatively limited because it's just an export order. But when you go and read the order, it's pretty much no dealings for
Yeah.
anyone. I mean, they start out with what the listed company can't do, which is normal, and then they basically say, and no other person can do the following things with these airlines,
Right.
and they're extremely expansive. So I think it's a good catch on your part to
Yeah,
flag that.
exactly right. And not just relating to US persons either. So in some ways
No,
it's
no
sort of
person.
yeah, it's any person anywhere around the world with respect to these entities. So just another sort of in the sort of miscellaneous interesting additional actions taken of late. I just wanted to throw that one out there. Anything else you want to sort of chime in with before we wrap up Russia and move on to North
So
Korea?
so after we finish recording, but before we release the next episode, the oil import ban will start tonight because the general license will expire at midnight. So
Good
no
call.
more Russian oil coming into the United States after tonight, unless you
Good
get a
call.
license.
Unless you get a license. Good call. All right. So with that, we are going to wrap Russia for this episode. I would say next time we will stay away from Russia, but I doubt that's the case. So
Yeah.
I won't even, I know I'll be wrong as soon as the words leave my mouth. So I won't even say it. Um, so with that, why don't we pivot to North Korea and to the sentencing of Virgil Griffith in SDNY that just occurred a few days ago, and I'll turn to Tim.
Yeah, we had to return to this story because this is the crypto bro that we have talked about before, who was somebody who was very knowledgeable about the cryptocurrency industry, had a business that was related to the cryptocurrency industry. Asked the State Department for permission to go to a crypto conference in North Korea, was told no, went anyway, spoke at the conference, and I think based on the original facts, this looked to me at least like kind of a silly case. It was kind of a like um don't don't ask for permission, and then when it's denied, do it anyway. But just kind of what could be the real harm of going to a conference? And I still think that there's some aspects of the case that are like that. But it but now that it's gone to sentencing, and Mr. Griffith got a pretty significant sentence on April 12th. He got a sentence of what, 63 months,
Yep.
which was the low end of the guidelines, by the way, but still a pretty significant
The
sentence.
fact that there was even a guideline sentence given here is notable because there's plenty of IEPA cases that don't result in a guideline sentence, especially
Exactly.
when there was no remuneration that he received at all for the
Right.
services that he allegedly rendered.
But, and this is, as someone who has defended many criminal cases and many cases like this, but the emails. As I was reading through some of the sentencing documents beforehand, there were apparently some pretty bad emails where Mr. Griffith was apparently talking about going to the conference and all of the ways that he could help the North Koreans evade the sanctions that were currently against them using cryptocurrency, and that could be very lucrative for him to be able to do. Now, I didn't see anything in the sentencing memos about that actually coming true, about him ever having made a bunch of money on this. But it does take this case out of kind of a goofy, nerdy crypto person going to North Korea because they're kind of naive about what the possible ramifications are, and turn it into a like, I'm going there to help them evade sanctions and make a lot of money type case, which I think is probably explains why he did not get a below guideline sentence.
Right. And again, I think it's important to point out he pled to conspiracy, right? So it
Yes.
doesn't really matter if that never came to fruition, right? And so he pled to conspiracy. Tim, I think, hit the nail on the head. There were some really awful emails that seem to establish pretty well the intent piece of this and the bad intent piece of this. There was, and then there's the also the fact that Tim mentioned, which is he asked the State Department for a visa or permission to go and was denied and went anyway. And so I think you add all that together, and that kind of cocktail of facts is really difficult to fight against. And I will say, and Tim and I both have experience in this, but I will say both on the government side and on the defense side, again, a guideline sentence in one of these cases is notable. And so even though it's at the bottom of the guidelines, I mean, this is a 5+ year sentence for going and speaking at a conference in in North Korea, but going and speaking at a conference. So that's what it boils down to. So and in many other cases that I was involved in or am aware of, there were, millions of dollars of money that were made of illicit proceeds for illegal exports and sanctions violations and what have you, and far lower custodial sentences imposed. So I do think it's just notable kind of on its own merits just for that reason, I think. And obviously I think this is clearly a case that will any defense counsel worth their salt down the road will try to distinguish based on some of the bad facts that Tim already mentioned, but that the government will now have in their pocket to be like, look, this is this is apples to apples here. Mr. Griffith did X, and this was, let's 63 months, or 63 to 78 months. That's the appropriate sentence here. So something again to be aware of, I think, generally speaking, for anybody who's wading into any of the criminal side of sanctions violations here, for certainly for defense counsel out there who are thinking about these things. This is one to certainly read up on. It's a case we followed pretty closely, and one that I think we'll see if ultimately this is an outlier. To some degree, all these cases end up being somewhat distinguishable on the facts, case to case, and that's part of the reason that um, sentencing outcomes are not very predictable in this area in particular. I think because there is just so much variance based on the facts and circumstances, and the sentencing factors, the guideline factors that are being brought to bear in each case. So, but just one that we wanted to highlight for everybody.
Yeah, I would say that this is one area, having taken a few clients to sentencing in this area, that is one of the most widely variable sentencing areas that I've seen. As you mentioned, Brian, a lot of the guidelines are high, so a lot of these cases come out below the guidelines. But there are some wild cards out there that I've seen that come out above the guidelines when you try to make sense of it all and getting ready for a sentencing hearing in these cases. It really is difficult because you can talk about every case being different on the facts, and they are. And this one had some facts that I would have preferred, if I were Mr. Griffith's defense lawyer, not to have there, mostly the emails. But still, like, under the underlying conduct is a willful sanctions violation in these cases, and you get sentences that are just all over the map given those same or similar basic facts.
Yeah, it varies district to district. It varies judge to judge. I mean, this is true of all. This is true, obviously, of all federal crimes, but I think in this area in particular, and having had to take a kind of extensive deep dive look at this on a number of occasions to compare these things across jurisdictions and across, sentencing judges, it is one where it tends to vary wildly. It's also the case that, bear in mind, these are not cases that get sentenced very often. So you're
Right.
not going to find too many judges who are repeat players here and have had an IEPA case that was, pled and went to sentencing, or he was sentenced after trial, or whatever the case may be. It may often be the case that a judge may get only one of these, especially in the usual suspects type districts like SDNY, EDNY, EDVA, DDC, which are probably the four that get the most. Even there, you're probably only dealing with the more experienced judges maybe have had two of these,
Right.
at most, right? So it's not like other federal crimes where you're going to have more of a sense of how this is all going to shake out. So anyway, Now we're kind of geeking out on the sentencing guidelines and sentencing tendencies across federal district courts, but it is something important to bear in mind, I think, for those out there who are thinking about these issues and making arguments in these types of cases, just to sort of think these things through and to account for some of this unpredictability.
Yep.
So with that, let's pause for the lightning round sound effect and one topic. And so here, Mr. Tool, I'm going to give you a hypo. So
Right.
and then we'll use that as a jumping off point. So if this is like if I were teaching a law school class right now, this would be a fun hypo to start with. So as you probably know, the draw for the World Cup occurred just recently since the last time we recorded. The U.S. managed to qualify this time around. Good for Team USA. And it turns out that in pool play, they are matched up with, among other countries, Iran, and will be playing a match against Iran in Qatar this fall when the World Cup is held. So here's the scenario. In the midst of the game, there's a corner kick. The Iranians line up for a corner kick, and the ball is sent into the box, and it ricochets off the head of a U.S. defender into the goal for an own goal. Is that a prohibited provision of services by that U.S. team member to the government of Iran? And would OFAC be issuing a penalty on the very next day as a result?
Oh, I think that would be maximum penalty immediately. I mean, certainly it is a sanctions violation. That is a provision of sporting services
Scoring an own
to
goal, scoring an own goal in a World Cup
yeah.
match on behalf of Iran by an American, I, I, I think that's hard to say that that's not.
There is no
That's,
general license that would allow for
there is no
that.
general
I can be
license to cover
sure.
that. So, we jest about this, but I want to actually use this as a jumping off point for a more serious conversation. And we've touched on this in the past, in particular when it came to the diplomatic boycott of by the U.S. of the Beijing Olympics. But for those who are following this, when the U.S. got matched up with Iran, not surprisingly, Twitter and many other corners of the internet lit up with similar kind of snarky, creative comments and questions and queries and scenarios about what it could mean when the U.S. plays Iran in the World Cup. Just recently, and this is part of the reason that this all kind of came to mind as something that was worthy of discussion, um, Wimbledon just announced that it was barring Russian nationals from participating in Wimbledon when the tournament starts in about 6 weeks or so. And that's a little bit of a change because it had sort of previously been the position, it seemed internationally, that any Russian um, you know, teams or Russian Federation was going to be barred, but now Wimbledon has decided unilaterally, it seems under a lot of pressure from the UK government, to just bar Russian nationals from participating at Wimbledon, which includes Medvedev, who's I think the number 2 player in the world right now. And so,
Yeah.
this is a big deal. And oddly and somewhat ironically, it seems that and we were just joking with our producer Matt ahead of the telecast or the broadcast that obviously in ice hockey world, we're here in DC with Alexander Ovechkin, and there's been some calls and some people who've taken shots at him and others who have been seen as kind of close to Putin or otherwise, kind of flag wavers for the Russian, hockey team in the past, as that there should be some actions taken against them. So I just want to sort of tee all of this up to say, yeah, and the last point I'll make is, oddly, even though this has, we're talking about blocking the largest bank in Russia, OFAC blocking the largest bank in Russia, and the impact that that has on the Russian economy, the global economy, is obviously, monumental by comparison to prohibiting a handful of Russian nationals from participating in certain international sporting events, or Iranian nationals, or fill in the blank, whatever country you want to talk about. But it seems that this is one that raises the ire, certainly, of the home governments, as much as anything, quite frankly, because of the symbolic value, right? And the idea that we're gonna sort of erase you, if you will, from and erase the best of your country from the world of international sport, which is a place that obviously countries have for many decades and centuries sought to kind of glorify themselves and their flags and their governments. And so, I'll just kind of stop there and throw that to you as to what your thoughts are on what I've just alluded to with the World Cup and Wimbledon and some of these other scenarios, and whether you think that there's any utility in this, or just kind of how you assess all of this generally.
I mean, it's actually a way harder question than I would have thought, and I'll tell you why I think it's so hard. And we talked about it with the Chinese Olympics as well. On the and I think this question is even harder. I you know I try on the podcast not to express my own kind of political, economic, what have you views. But it's really hard to watch what's going on in Ukraine without just being appalled by the Russian government and by what Putin is doing in Ukraine. It's just shocking, and so it's very hard not to be so upset by this that you can justify doing anything, not only to Russia but to Russians. Um, that said, instinctually, I think it's terrible to go after Russian athletes simply because they're Russian. Has a it has they whatever they have little ability to affect the war, probably zero ability for most of them. It doesn't seem like going after Alex Ovechkin, to just pick an example, based on the appalling behavior of the Russian government, is serves any particular purpose other than to just kind of, it's almost a form of national origin type discrimination. We hate Russia, and so we're gonna just punish all things Russia without regard to the point. But it does have a symbolic value, and it does kind of express the values of the country, that what the Russian government is doing is terrible and we're just not going to have anything to do with you. So I find it to be a really hard question. I generally like to keep politics out of sports. I think that it does that sports is a good place, and I'm happy that the U.S. is playing Iran, even though I'm not a fan of the Iranian government either, and they've done a lot of really objectively bad things. But I don't know why that is, because I do get that sanctioning high profile athletes from a particular country can not only have symbolic value, but it can also I expect that it would get at Putin in the same way that sanctioning him personally does. It doesn't really serve any purpose. I mean, Putin is going to be able to spend money in Russia whether we put him on the SDN list or not. But we're trying to send a message with it, and sanctioning high-profile Russian athletes, particularly ones close to the government in Russia, or at least seemingly close to the government, might serve the same purpose. I just hate the idea instinctually.
Yeah, it's a finger in the eye to Putin and to the government in a pretty big way, right? And I think and we've talked about this before. We talked about this when we talked about the Beijing Olympics. I think another sort of interesting wrinkle here is, there are obviously plenty of Russian nationals who are very, I think, to your point, that what's happening in Ukraine's appalling, and there are plenty of Russian nationals who agree that it is appalling and disagree adamantly with everything their government is doing at the moment. Now, obviously, having the ability to speak out on that is limited, if not impossible, certainly for people who are in Russia, I think, for the most part, unless they take their lives, they're willing to jeopardize their own lives and the lives of their family. For athletes, though, an interesting kind of wrinkle there, right? Because if you have, and again, I'm not suggesting that there should be some kind of litmus test to, if you're opposed to the war, then you can participate, and if you're with your home country government, then you can't participate. I'm not necessarily saying that that's a sensible way to go about this, but there is something to that, right? Is to, again, to the extent that the high profile elite athletes are, again, kind of symbolic tokens or pawns of their home governments. And if you're sort of taking those things off the board, taking those people off the board, you know, you sort of that's a cost that at least some governments are willing to pay to again, uh, exact some sort of symbolic price at the minimum to Putin and to the government. And so, um, I don't know. I agree. I think I'm of many minds and many thoughts on this. I don't think that it's sort of susceptible of easy answers. Um, and yeah, I think it's just it's kind of a fascinating exercise to just think about it. Similar thing, right? Let's say after the U.S. Iran game, a U.S. player takes his jersey off and signs it and hands it to one of the Iranian players, and then we have on video that he's essentially committed a sanctions violation, right? Like,
Right.
what is that now? The idea that that would ever be pursued or enforced is fairly ludicrous, which is part of the reason that we're just kind of bringing these things up, as to sort of illustrate to some degree the lengths that you could sort of spin these things out. But um, I think it's just I think we're maybe not quite through the looking glass, but this is sort of the sort of the policy, and in particular the sanctions policy, and sort of the way that we've gone about, or the thinking that informs sanctions policy being kind of adopted. And obviously this is not new. Boycotts and prohibitions on the participation in international sporting events are decades old at this point. This is not a late breaking development, but it is fascinating that there's been this kind of there is a little bit of convergence here, and some of the same many of the same things that are informing one are certainly informing the other, and are they're kind of becoming part of the same conversation, just kind of on a spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's so hard because every ounce of me wants to just say it's sports. Just kind of leave it alone and leave it as the last kind of refuge where you know people can just kind of coexist regardless of nationality and just participate, and merit will win, and there'll be a camaraderie and what have you. But uh, on the other hand, like the World Cup is huge business. Wimbledon is huge business. Sporting events generally are huge business, and huge business is kind of the realm of economic sanctions. So it's really hard for me to explain why I think they should just stay out of it. But it just seems unfair, and I don't know why it's any more unfair than the rest of the sanctions that are targeting often innocent companies in sanctioned jurisdictions that can't do anything about their government policy and have no ability to change it, but are still kind of targeted by the sanctions, which seems unfair at the micro level, but I totally get at the macro level.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of one last comment here, and this has turned into a decidedly lightning round topic, but it is as we are wont to do from time to time. But I think this is just kind of a fascinating sort of thought exercise. Obviously we're not far away from the era when certain powers that be were imploring U.S. athletes in particular, and black U.S. athletes specifically, to shut up and dribble or shut up and play, and not to interject politics into sports. And obviously, I think I think I can speak for me and Tim. We fundamentally disagree with that aspect of
Right.
not interjecting politics to sports, like the idea that and so this is in some ways kind of the bizarro flip side of that, right? Is if you have athletes who are perhaps either have been in the past or now are supporting their governments, or maybe are just being silent, either out of necessity or because they do perhaps support their government, but recognize that there would be probably more severe costs to that would come to them if they were to speak out in support because of where they are now living or plying their trade. They don't do that, and does silence equal assent? That's that these are all again interesting questions that I don't have easy answers for, but it is all somewhat wrapped up in this same idea that for good or for ill, what sports is kind of symbolically now, on the especially at the highest level, the international stage, the elite level, it is perhaps more, and it is big business, as Tim said, and that's exactly right. And the idea of hitting these interests, uh, and not only putting a symbolic dent in Russia's pride, perhaps, but also in the bottom line and the ability of some of its highest, most well-known performers to profit while the war is going on. I think that's, again, just a very interesting, difficult sort of topic to grapple with. And I think we're going to see, I think, there's been a lot of quick reaction to the Wimbledon thing. I think that's going to hold, although I think they've been criticized, and we'll see what happens. But there's going to be more of this. I mean, we're going to see more of this. It's going to get messier and messier over the coming months, especially if the war continues to drag on. So be prepared for there to be some more, messiness in this area.
Yeah. And on Russia, I mean, I definitely think that part of it is that this war is seen as, I mean, it's openly called in a lot of the U.S. media, Putin's war. And Putin is somebody
Putin's
who's
war of choice.
Right, his war of
That's
choice.
The State
Sorry,
Department's. Yeah, that's how they like to.
But Putin his brand is kind of linked with sports, and so the idea that if you're trying to essentially hurt Putin where he lives, that you would kind of carve out the sporting realm from that seems like you're leaving an opportunity on the table. But again, I just keep coming back to I hate the idea that we're punishing these athletes who have such a short window of competition and have really devoted their lives to sport and not to politics. It just seems unfair to me, but I get the other argument.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, let's put that to rest, as again our 20-minute long lightning round segment will come to a conclusion, having resolved absolutely nothing, of course. But anyway, thank you for indulging us. So that's all we have for this episode. This will be up last week of April, and I think we're going to be back on the regular schedule, although we have some more international travel ahead in May, so we may have to readjust again, but I think we'll have another episode up at some point, kind of middle of May, on the normal schedule. And so, yeah. So any parting words before we wrap, Mr. O'Toole?
No, the longest lightning round segment in the history of lightning round segments is now ended.
It's probably not, actually, given our very.
It's only 20 minutes.
All right. On that note, we're going to wrap, but thank you all for joining us. And until next time, stay safe and stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody.
All right. Bye.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.